So a lot of you realize that big mature timber is not ideal for whitetail habitat. But is there a good or better way to log than a different way if your goal is specifically whitetail habitat? I'm here to tell you that there is a huge difference between some of these harvests and the results you're going to get. This has been from personal experience, walking on a bunch of different properties and even being able to walk on properties after they've been harvested several years down the line and seeing the results of that, and realizing that there's a drastic difference between a standard, harvest if you're looking to manage over a long period of time for the timber, or a whitetail type of harvest. I've had the privilege of hunting a bunch of different properties throughout Ohio, and on my personal property, it's 55 acres, and we harvested the timber on that 4 years ago. And being on the backside of that now, seeing some of the results of that, to be honest, at the time, I did not have input on how that property was going to be harvested. And I was simply doing the subcontract work and actually doing the cutting. And it felt like we were just taking way too many trees when we were in there, because, if you look at it from a long-term sustainability standpoint of doing a harvest every 10, 15 years, it was going to be a long time till we could do another harvest on this property, and it felt like we were taking a lot of trees. But I've had the privilege of hunting that property now for 4 years on the backside of that, and I have seen results that have blown my mind. And so I want to walk you guys through, and having kind of experimented now with a bunch of different properties and owning a bunch of different properties, kind of what to actually do when you're looking to maximize for the whitetail habitat. The very first thing that I learned, this particular property was extremely open when we first got to it. I mean, it had huge mature oak trees all over it. There was very little security cover on this property. Like I said, 55 acres. It did have quite a bit of different topography. It had some ridges, some fingers, draws, that type of thing. But as far as security cover, it had very little. When I first walked onto that property, there were just deer, bucks, sign everywhere. And this sort of baffled me, and it threw me for a loop for a while, because in my mind, I was thinking that its cover is not very important, and that, you can do these light harvests and get away with it, because, clearly on this property, I walked in and I actually see a buck that I would later then chase for quite a few years. But there was a realization after I talked to the landlord of what was actually happening. He had not walked back into the woods for 15 years. He was an older gentleman, couldn't get around as well anymore, and nobody had hunted it for that amount of time either. And so I realized ultimately pressure is what determines whether a buck is going to be there or not. I do believe that a super low pressure area, I mean, you see this, you see these deer out in the middle of a town and they're not phased at all. And a lot of that's because of no hunting pressure. There's no hunting pressure there, and the habitat is not that great. But when you begin to apply hunting pressure, you have to have the habitat on point. So we attempted to hunt this kind of the year that we were doing the harvest, and while it was still open, it was super difficult. You couldn't get to your stand sites without busting deer. At one point, I had deer busting me from several hundred yards away as they're coming into my area. It was just so open, they could just see from that far away. And that was a huge lesson that I learned on that yes, you can have open areas and stuff, and that's not going to determine necessarily, it's ultimately pressure. And when you hunt a property, you are going to apply some pressure, 1 degree or another. And when you begin to do that, you have to be able to get in and out of that property undetected. And this is where the habitat comes into play. So we did that harvest, and like I explained before, we did a very hard harvest. We took that property, I think we harvested at 18 inches point of cut, so that's cutting 18 inches at the very bottom of the tree. You're not measuring up top, at the bottom, and a lot of these trees flared out of the bottom. And so really, you're taking a pretty small tree at 18 inches. And those first year or two, it, to be frank, didn't look the greatest. It was pretty rough. But on the back side of that, I began to see deer, and like the amount of deer that began to use that blew my mind. So I'm gonna walk you through a little bit. The last 2 years, this was a deer that I chased for a little while. This was actually this year. He dropped both sides before I was able to get a chance. He dropped them early December. And this was a deer that I chased for a year as well. Unfortunately, he died of EHD. This was 160-inch mainframe 8-point. This was a really good 3-year-old that I passed multiple times. Looking forward to seeing what he turns into. I chased a 180-inch 18-point that used this property this year as well. Was unable to find the sheds off of that deer, but also came off this same property. I harvested him in 2021, and that was not the biggest deer using that property. But I had multiple giants using this property at the same time. It's 55 acres, it's a tiny little property, but somehow this property was a complete buck magnet. And I do believe a lot of that has to do with the security cover. The interesting part about it is, up to this point, I haven't had access to the fields to be able to put food into them. So while the neighbors have some ag and nobody's really doing food plots, there's very little food on this property, yet they're still using it even in late season, and you can see that by the amount of sheds that I'm finding. And all of that is to do with the regeneration. When you do such a hard harvest, you're opening up that canopy and letting the sunlight in, and that's getting you a bunch of new saplings coming up, and it's incredibly thick on that property. Almost to a detriment. I'm gonna have to probably begin to open up some areas just so the deer can walk through them a little bit easier, but letting that sunlight in just explodes that new growth and has, food now on the deer's level to be able to eat and hide, and it also begins to make your property feel bigger. So like I said, this property does have some topography, so that helps. A completely flat property is going to not be able to hold as many deer at one time, but a property like this, the bucks can separate themselves a little bit while staying on that 55 acres. And I've had the luxury of being able to see, multiple mature deer using this little corner out of a 1,000-acre, valley. And for some reason, like I said, they're just coming back to this spot, and I do believe that it comes down to the security cover and the browse that's there, and also obviously how I'm hunting it. I'm trying to keep pressure off the property and let most of it be a sanctuary, but doing harvests like this allow me to do that. So like I said, we did a 18-inch point of cut, but we did this over the entire property. And like looking back now, I realized, that wasn't, while it was good, it created a lot of cover, it makes it actually, in a way, a little bit more difficult to access now. This property has the unique feature of having a ravine that essentially runs the property line, the whole length of the property. And so I'm able to slip down that ravine and use that to my advantage to get all the way back. The issue is though, if you have solid cover all the way out to your borders, it makes it difficult to access because deer are bedding just kind of all over your property. I, in consulting now, am doing a little bit different of a harvest approach and doing more of these hard harvests in select areas. And what this allows you to do, it's a little bit more predictable where the deer are going to bed on the property, and it again spaces them out, but it lets you access through your borders where we're taking fewer trees and it's open. You know that the deer aren't going to be bedding there. It's not that they aren't going to cross through there, but it allows access to you in the in the morning while you're trying to get back to your tree stand. The deer aren't bedding right there. So it allows for getting in and out of that property without busting as many deer. The other thing I like about this too is, it gives a little bit more of a sustainability approach. You're not taking as many trees You're leaving some on, and you can view this. I'll put the link to this video up here, I guess. It is a property up in Michigan that I consulted on a couple months ago, and the way we designed that was essentially a triangle block of woods, and we have up front we have some cover, and then in the back we have pockets where we want the deer to be bedding in it, and it happened to lay out really nice on this property with the ridges and stuff that we could easily do that. But then we left a lot of mature timber along the edge to be able to access them, to stay on location from the back side of that bedding, which is my favorite setup, end of October, early November, in those mornings, to get back in the back of the bedding areas before those bucks get back there. I like doing, harder cuts in those bedding area pockets and stuff, and then outside of that, doing a little bit lighter harvests. And, obviously placement of those bedding areas is very important to be able to get in and out of your properties. It's super important. So I'm gonna quit rambling. See you guys next time.